Hello, this is Kyle again, and this video is about using variables and assigning values with Python. Now, we'll be talking a lot more about what variables are in the first real video series. This is just getting started. This is just a way of getting you acquainted with Python and showing you some basic things. And we'll be continuing the example we started in the last video, and we'll be continuing it through the next video. This is a really good opportunity for you to put together your first Python program, and so let's just continue with that. But first, maybe we should loosely define what is a variable. A variable is something that exists in almost all programming languages, and it is something that stores a value in memory, and it can change during the run of the program. The variable is named, and that represents the location in memory where the value is stored. The name variable, you might be familiar from high school math classes, where we would say we have a variable named x, and that's kind of the same concept. We have this thing, we can call it x if we wanted to, that's not a great name, but we could call it x and then we can assign it a value and see what result happens when we use that value x. In many programming languages, variables and this other thing called constants, which is sort of also a named place in memory, but it's one that it can't be changed, they have to be declared and they have to be assigned a data type. That's very common in all the C-like languages, so C# and C++ and Java and all those things. But Python, although data types very much exist in Python, they're automatically assigned their data type based on what type of value they're assigned. So there are no variable declarations. We'll have more details on variables, what they are, how to use them in the next video series, not coming up immediately. But this is just the basics to get us started. Anyway, let's go back to our example. So here's our example file again, and as I said before, it would be nice for you to follow along, try things out the way I'm doing it, maybe even try making changes and see if you can learn something just by experimenting. But for now, let me just do this and get this working. So the last thing I said I was going to do was assign the name of the company. And so I'm going to create a variable to hold the name of the company. And I'm going to call that variable company name. And I'm going to set it equal to SEIT widgets and flanges. So I've hit enter on that line, and there's a couple things you might notice really quickly. You're going to notice some things about where it says company name. Company name is the name of the variable. You're going to notice a few things. I've named it. You have to name a variable. Company name is now the name of the variable, and that can be accessed. And you'll see some demos related to this in class. But that name is company name, and it's done using lowercase and an underscore, again, because of the style guide, which was briefly mentioned in the last video, and will be mentioned a lot more in the near future. You'll also notice it has turned kind of this light blue shade. As Visual Studio Code is recognizing the components of the Python programming language, it does a thing where it colors them so you more quickly know what they are. And things that are blue are identifiers, they're names for things. Things that are green are the comments, and you can see here that where it says SEIT widgets and flanges, it's made it kind of a pale red color. Well, that's so you can recognize what's called string data. String data is data that basically it represents text. And so this one, we know it's text for a few reasons. The main one being I've enclosed it in quotation marks. And so we know that that's representing some text data, and we can use it to print that text data later, for example. The coloration here, although some things are pretty common between different development environments, this is specific to Visual Studio Code, and in fact, it can be re-themed if you don't like these colors. There's all kinds of themes available. But also, if you were doing this in Idle or PyCharm or some other environment, you might see different colors. But still, they use the colors to differentiate the different parts of the programming language. Anyway, we're going to do a few more variables here. I'm just going to do them quickly, and then we'll discuss them. So I'm going to, just like I said above, I'm going to assign the number of employees. There's 4 things I said I needed. This is one of them too. So I'm going to go number of employees equals 37. I'm going to go assign the fiscal year. I said I wanted that. And I'll go fiscal year, I'll just call it. No reason to give that a terrible, confusing name. And assign the projected gross sales. And that'll be some number. And you can see they've all ended up being a little different. You can see the names. I've stuck with that lowercase formatting with the underscores between words because that's proper according to PEP8. You can use other names, but it's not recommended, especially for this course because we're using a style guide. But there's interesting things about each of these. As I hover over this one, it tells you it's a literal and it gives you the value. And that's pretty normal. This one ends up different. You can see that the number 37, for example, doesn't show up in the pale red color that I was describing a moment ago. And that's because this is an integer value. And so When I hover over this variable name, it gives me a little bit of information about that variable name. Again, this is one of those things that can be different depending on the environment. But here in VS Code, for me, it shows as a literal 37. Usually this type of thing is referred to in most programming languages as an integer. It's a whole number, and whole numbers are special data types, especially for counting things, and they're very useful because integers are small and easy to store, easy to work with. They're for fast transactions, I guess you could say. And so it keeps this one separate and calls it an integer. And you don't put it in quotation marks because it's not text data. Now here we got 2022, and I did put it in quotation marks, and that might seem like I'm being a bit of a hypocrite, but I'm not, and how rude of you to say that. Something like a year, it's reasonably unlikely that I'm going to need to do math on it. Maybe I could in certain situations. Maybe I'll want to be able to count through the years successively. But for any piece of numeric data that I don't anticipate math being done on, sometimes it makes sense to store it as a piece of text data so that it can't accidentally be used in a mathematical operation. And then we've got projected gross sales. And this one's interesting. It looks a lot like this 37, at least in terms of the color and the way I wrote it. But you'll see it's in the pale green. But it shows here when I hover over it as a float. And float is a special word used, again, in some programming languages, but especially Python, to represent numbers that include decimal places. And that's the distinction between that and an integer. A floating point number does allow decimal places. And so these are our 4 variables I said we needed above: a company name, number of employees, the fiscal year, and the projected gross sales for the year. So that's 4 variables. I've assigned them. And these are considered assignment statements. It's an interesting thing to get used to, especially if you're coming from a background of pure math. Every time you see one of these equal signs after an identifier name, even if it's a variable name you're just making up, it's saying set this thing on the left equal to this thing on the right. We'll talk about more details of these assignments later, along with the output. We're not going to do the output during this video. So in this video, we talked about using variables and assigning values to them in Python. And in the next video, we'll talk about producing output with Python. I keep saying with Python and in Python because this type of thing, although I say a lot of concepts are general to programming languages, and declaring variables is something that's general like that, it does look different in different programming languages. If you want to check in on your knowledge right now, see if you can explain, even just briefly or vaguely, what a variable is. And if you can't do that right now, that's okay, because we're still going to talk about it more later. Thanks for watching.